So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War, and it's been a little minute since we ventured into Silmarillion for any sort of battle replay, but hopefully between now and the end of the year I do intend for these midweek slots to be filled up with some of these slightly smaller Silmarillion battles, which many of the testing that is done on Silmarillion is done on maps which are a little bit quicker perhaps, and on the open field a little bit more than we see in Reforged, and had a little bit of a difficulty getting this one to work initially after just getting in from work with the updates that have happened. Got to be a little bit careful when it's always nice to have these more regular updates with Silmarillion, but it does mean you've got to be careful with what replays you decide to show, because builds can become outdated a little bit more quickly. But yes, again, not the longest battle this one, but that's kind of by design, because we will be looking at some of the updates in a mechanical sense from Silmarillion here, so we can get into these slightly more bite-sized battles, and it does mean that my schedule will hopefully between now and the end of the year be filled out to its fullest again, albeit in a slightly different format with 2 videos a week between now and when January rolls around, hopefully, but we'll see. As I was mentioning anyway, Silmarillion, we do have a couple of Nan Dungortheb armies, and they're going to be facing off against Ossiriand, and I don't know who they're actually marching alongside. Didn't get a good look at them when they popped in. The House of Boar, so the good aligned Easterling faction. Nan Dungortheb, of course, much more about their monstrous units and slightly lighter infantry, perhaps savage attacking, based around some of the more impressive singular units that they have. Ossiriand, of course, much more based around their archery, and the House of Boar around a good solid infantry core with a bit of arm piercing and polearm action thrown in there as well. So some different focuses on display today, and hopefully the mechanical differences will make themselves apparent as we go along as a result of these very different ways of engaging in battle. We'll start off with Panthan and Barsoom here, who is the one who posted this replay up on the Silmarillion Discord. That is worth mentioning as well. In terms of harvesting these Silmarillion replays, I've kind of been left to my own devices. I'm not getting sent any directly. Really, it's just a case of picking out by replay name and by any sort of comments that are attached to them what I want and what I don't. So Ossiriand here, obviously a lighter elven faction, perhaps the lightest elven faction that the game has to offer, but plenty of ambush potential, plenty of long-range firepower as well. Scouts of Gallion are basic as far as archers go, and in terms of getting involved in a prolonged skirmish fight, you don't really want it with the Scouts of Gallion, but Nan Dungortheb are not really a faction designed to be standing and shooting too much either, so I imagine that Ossiriand with their archers here are going to be just trying to find some good open terrain and shoot into the slightly lighter Nan Dungortheb troops as much as they can without getting bowled over by stuff like the spiders, but we'll see if Ossiriand is able to do that. Ossiriand do, like any faction, there are going to be exceptions to the rule, and they do have some slightly heavier units. The Kinsmen of Denethor over here being the heaviest that they have, even among the bodyguard units. The other Ossiriand units are a little bit more designed for dealing damage, be it armor piercing or otherwise. The Kinsmen of Denethor, on the other hand, are heavier spears, so that does give them a nice core to their army, but of course there are only so many of them. Ultimately, Ossiriand are a lighter faction, and many of their units will have to act accordingly. More Scouts of Gallion here. Just in behind them we've got some Spearmen of Rathloriel, which by Ossiriand standards I suppose are more medium spear units. They certainly have lighter units than this, but by the standards of many other factions that the game has to offer, they would be considered light. But still, as far as the front line goes, you could stand to do far worse, and in terms of infantry on infantry combat, Ossiriand shouldn't be too concerned about Nan Dungortheb. They do have the damage values, Nan Dungortheb, to be a real problem to Ossiriand, but Ossiriand have got the finesse to kind of cancel that out. But for the most part, Ossiriand will be wanting to do their damage at range, and the Earthen End Tower over here represent one of the better units that Ossiriand have for doing so. Not only that, but they do back that up by being fairly sturdy in melee and fairly damaging as well. Probably the best unit of, if you were to go in blind to any kind of fight and you wanted a sort of catch-all kind of unit, the Earthen End Tower probably is that for Ossiriand. They have armor piercing in melee, but they're also reasonably armoured compared to some of the other Ossiriand units, so they're at least a little bit more resilient, but also some really good and solid ranged damage as well. Exactly the sort of multifaceted nature which will help them against any opponent, Nan Dungortheb included. Skirmishers of Rathloriel, more of a medium archer unit in comparison to the Scouts of Gallion just in front of them. So again, They're going to be a little bit more resilient in melee when the need arises as well, which I think is going to be more important given the nature of their opponents here. A detachment of Earthen Tower, this is something which Silmarillion has as a point of uniqueness. You can, for some units, have a half-strength version for half the cost, though of course this comes with all of the downsides of having a half-strength unit. They're not going to be as powerful right from the off, which for a ranged unit, the DPS is also pretty affected by that as well, but of course as the elves, you're not always going to have the budget to be able to deal with their demands. More Spearmen of Rathlori. We have the cavalry as well, Scouts of Galleon, and trading back and forth with ranged cavalry is something they may be engaging in with Nan Dungortheb. I mean, the Sentries of Galleon are not the most armoured, but they are pretty quick. They are pretty numerous for a horse archer unit as well, and as an elven force as well, their damage isn't really too negatively affected. We've got more Sentries of Galleon here, a detachment version, is it? No, still 60 of them. So 2 full units of them, going to be flooding the field with those horse archers. We'll see if they can do appropriate damage, especially to the spiders, which will be in direct opposition to them. Outriders of Dweilman are a Lancer unit, so very much a hit and run kind of thing here. They're going to be able to do a lot of damage off the charge to some of the foul orcs that are on foot today. But if they do get caught up in and amongst the spiders, their own defensive frailties may be revealed. 2 units of them as well. I don't think there's any other units that we can see. I mean, there are more Hunters of Rathloriel back here, which are a Javelin unit. Again, could be useful. I mean, javelins like this, it can really depend on whether they're skirmishing javelins or hard target javelins, whether or not they're going to be super effective. And then back here we do have probably the best unit of all-round infantry that Ossiriand have, the Maithern and Tolgalen. I don't know how useful the armour piercing is necessarily going to be against Nan Dungortheb, who are more about offensive values and numbers on foot, and then their monstrous units, armour piercing will be useful against, but monstrous units do have a tendency to be classed as cavalry as well, so that will not be the be-all and end-all against them, though it certainly won't hurt. 2 units of Maithern and Tolgalen actually, so they do have a lot of their heavier units actually, Ossiriand. I mean, they're never going to be a really heavy-duty up-front kind of faction, but they're going to be a little bit more resilient perhaps than they would otherwise be, which may be very useful against the monsters that they are facing. House of Boar, on the other hand, the Amberona Honour Guard, they are a more sturdy and defensively minded unit of bodyguard infantry when you compare them to the Maithern. They're not armour-piercing, however, they carry that single-handed axe, so they're going to be decently damaging in melee, but they are certainly a more defensively minded unit of bodyguard infantry. I mean, the House of Boar, of all of the forces on the field today, have got the most conventional, heavier infantry force when you consider the Honour Guard here, and then in and amongst them they also have, are they Salamandrine Dragon Hunters now instead of just the Halberdiers? That's a very grand name, but then the Halberdiers have been, ever since Silmarillion was first brought out, they have been really the heart and soul of any Easterling infantry force. And that will certainly be the case here, given the spiders are classed as cavalry, and this will make the infantry a far harder target than they would otherwise be. Salamandrine Guard on horseback, probably a better all-round unit of horse archers than the Scouts of Galleon that Ossiriand have brought, and also they have that anti-monster capability that they've been known for ever since they were introduced as well, which should stand them in very good stead against Nan Dungortheb. They're pretty much the ideal matchup for them. Maybe less so for some of the other House of Boar units, but the Salamandrine Guard, if they're used well by Stewie, should be a very important unit indeed. We've got the Clan Guard of Lothlin, a standard unit of line infantry, which again slightly heavier than pretty much anything else that's going to be on the field outside of the bodyguard tier units on all 3 of the other armies on the field today, backed up again by the Halberdiers of Lothlin. So actually no, the Salamandrine Dragon Hunters must be a unique variant on the Halberdiers. We've got the Hunters of Lothlin as well, so some more javelins, which are always going to be useful against those bigger units. Another new unit as well, the Silver Wind, a javelin cavalry unit. Interesting to see how they get on. Should be again ideal for dealing with the spiders, so the House of Boar perhaps well tooled for dealing with Nan Dungortheb with all of the units we've seen so far. And they also have a lance on their back as well, so an aggressive unit indeed. Once their javelins have run out. Skirmishers of Lothlin, the rest of the Easterling force, hidden in and amongst the trees, so we shall see what else Boar has in store. And move on to the red team, most of which also are going to be hidden in the trees by the looks of things, but starting off with Captain Gervais. He has got some Duso Manuthan Flesh Tearers here, standard unit of line infantry for Nan Dungortheb. I mean, again, numerous as you would expect. Not going to be the best in terms of individual quality, especially when they throw themselves against the House of Boar's front line. But really the key is that their front line needs to be numerous and savage enough to at least deal some damage but stay standing in their numbers for as long as they possibly can. And then other units are going to be the main problem and challenge for the Easterlings to deal with. Flesh Terror is going to be backed up by the Duso-Manuthan Predators. They're going to have the Javelins as well, so throwing projectiles are fairly ubiquitous in Silmarillion, and their use is very important to any army's success. And that is going to be the case here as well, though interesting to see who wins that particular duel between Nan Dungortheb and the Easterlings, maybe on an even kilter, considering the mounted options that the Easterlings have at their disposal. The Duso-Manuthan Flesh Feasters are the highest tier of infantry that Nan Dungortheb can field. Pretty savage as well with their dual axes, going to be pretty good against some of the lighter units on the field today, though the Easterlings will be in a pretty good place to be able to resist this kind of damage. Again, in terms of outright military might on foot, Nan Dungortheb are not going to want to make the battle all about that, but this is the kind of unit which can at least make the Easterlings' job that a little bit more difficult. It's going to be with the Spiders, mostly, where Nan Dungortheb are going to hope to win both here and against Ossiriand. It is worth mentioning that they'll have to go about both of those different factions in different ways, but Karangwi Blood Gorges over here, very limited in terms of their numbers, but individually very resilient. It's the sort of thing as well where if they get involved in sort of chaotic cavalry fights, even against infantry, it can be difficult, and of course Spiders, if you collide with the enemy appropriately, it's the sort of thing which can certainly leave them reeling mentally. Also, the Devourers of Children, which is a horrifying name, especially when you look at them here, they are a pretty resilient unit, maybe not as devastating in melee, or at least they never were, as you would expect given their look and name, but even the Easterlings' heavier hitters are going to have trouble dealing with them quickly, which puts them in sort of big... It puts them in context, really, or comparison to the infantry that's in front of them, given the, given the get my words out, Nan Dungortheb's infantry is more numerous and damage orientated, whereas the Devourers of Children less damage orientated but more tanky than the infantry that's in front of them. And then just behind them we also have the Karangwi Broodmothers, which have that sort of traditional monstrous cavalry feel to them, where there are several sort of individuals riding them and they have a ranged attack and they can barrel through enemy lines and all of that. Moving along, we have got the other army, which is going to be played by Tundra's Fox. He's got some Duso-Manuthan Flesh Terrors, once again the standard unit of line infantry, plenty of them as well, so maybe a more numbers infantry focus here, but obviously Ossiriand have got the archers to be able to deal with that. I mean, Duso-Manuthan Beast Hunters will be there to at least contest the ranged fight with Ossiriand. They're never going to win that particular fight, of course, but going forward in their numbers, archers first to draw the fire, and then sweeping across the hills with this very numerous infantry and very deadly cavalry force. We already mentioned the Blood Gorgers, who if they can catch up with any of the Ossiriand cavalry in melee, it's going to be a real problem. Flesh Feasters, we've already mentioned them. Against Ossiriand in melee, actually, the Flesh Feasters should be really good, given that they have, or Ossiriand lack the armour that the House of Boar do have. We also have, over here, the general is still floating behind it, but the Urush Abomination. This is a sort of living artillery piece, throwing projectiles down range, and also, of course, as a single entity model, not too dissimilar to the sort of thing you would see in Warhammer. They can be really difficult to take down if you've got the wrong kind of unit up against them in melee with that huge axe that he has. Then we have some Karangwi Hunters, so mounted spider archers. This is the sort of thing as well, which trading back and forth with the Ossiriand cavalry, it's going to be a case of the more resilient individually Karangwi Hunters against the more numerous, perhaps swifter Elven Riders, but of course very vulnerable to any projectiles that do hit them. A couple of units of them, in fact 4 units of them, so that's a big investment into this unit. So it's going to be interesting to see who comes out on top of these fights. I mean, there's no real need for a cut here, given the fact that it's only a 9,000 frame battle and things are going to get underway pretty quickly. I think Nan Dungortheb in particular have got a vested interest in getting into the enemy ranks quickly, given Ossiriand a downrange, but without further ado, I suppose, let's get this show on the road. Interestingly enough, what I'm going to be looking for most of all here, I think, considering all of the new bits and pieces mechanically which we saw in the last battle between Angband and Fëanor, is going to be the juxtaposition between the smaller but more powerful units perhaps, and on this occasion that's more often than not going to be the monstrous units from Nan Dungortheb, and then the very different ways in which these factions are going to be approaching things. I mean, when it comes to more traditional styles of warfare that we often see in Medieval 2, the House of Boar over here are probably the best equipped to engage in that kind of battle, perhaps with their solid blocks of infantry, some good support, and then their cavalry can be the monster hunters that they need them to be. That would probably be how Stewie is going to want to approach this battle, whereas everyone else on the field is going to have to engage in something a little bit different. Nan Dungortheb, as a general rule, they do have the numbers, and they do have some pretty scary units in and amongst them as well, the Devourers of Children and the Spiders, first and foremost among them, but artillery. And there you can see, move back over to here, that is the Urush Abomination, which is not a new thing. There are some new types of units which have been added, which we touched upon briefly in the last battle replay as well. But the Urush Abomination is kind of in the same sort of vein, but it's been in the game for longer. This is a problem for Ossiriand, because while most of these units are simply being knocked over, any projectiles that do hit Ossiriand are not really best equipped to try and withstand that sort of thing, and nor do they have the numbers to be able to do this either. They need all of their infantry to be able to withstand the kind of pressure that the Spiders are going to be putting on them later on in the battle. Last thing they need is to be withering on the vine, so to speak, taking hits at the hands of that artillery. And I think actually at this moment we will decrease the speed. As with most of these, they're probably going to be fairly short and sweet. As the Urush Abomination continues to move in, and now we're seeing the scouts of Gellion start to open up. So while the early pressure has been forthcoming from the Urush Abomination, as the battle goes on, you can see the poison projectiles from the Duso Manuthan units across the way, but routing the elves, while not impossible in Silmarillion, it is still something that requires a concerted effort, and you need other forms of pressure to really lay them low in that way. But the Flesh Tearers also, I mean, any arrow that hits is likely to result in a kill. All of these Duso Manuthan units are not the most resilient. That wasn't the case before the overhaul, and it will not be the case now. Have to look to their overlords over in Angband for such things. The Karangwi Hunters, however, when it comes to just pure trading back and forth, the resilience of the Spider Riders is probably going to be the thing which stands them in pretty good stead. Meanwhile, over here, on these wooden and stone ruins, you can see the Urush Abomination taking hits. Karangwi Gore Swarm as well, which look like giant ticks, but they're very much a tar pit kind of unit. Duso Manuthan Skull Splitters moving, the Brood Mother as well. So I mean, they have to be a little bit careful here. The House of Boar, Hunters of Lothland getting into a position, trying to concentrate fire on the Urush Abomination to bring it down. Two of them. Single entity units are certainly not invincible in Medieval 2, and if you do focus fire them down, the damage can add up pretty damn quickly. But the same is also true of these Easterling Javelins. They can't just stand here and take this kind of damage indefinitely all day, and they are lighter Javelins as well. They're not really intended to be the first ones into a beefy melee engagement, and the Gore Swarm they'll be reasonably okay against, but stuff like the Devourers of Children, they're not going to have the damage to be able to bring them down. Hunters of Lothland, the Javelins from the Karangwi Brood Mother as well, a little bit more typical perhaps, this kind of monstrous unit. Large elephant class units with some javelin men on the back just for that extra bit of damage. It's not going to start particularly well for the House of Boar here, but we'll have to see if their overall quality and certainly higher rigidity in melees serves them in good stead. Karangwi Gore Swarm charging into the initial Lothland front lines. Well, Karangwi Hunters really pushing the sentries of Galleon away, but they're pretty far away themselves now, the Karangwi hunters, and they may be more important as a supporting tool for their army than the horse archers are for Ossiriand, if it comes down to that sort of thing. But I have to say I'm a little surprised. I mean, the Duso Manuthan Beast Hunters are doing a pretty decent job at skirmishing so far, but much of this will be as a result of them not being the first choice of targets for the opposing archers. Meanwhile, over here there are some Salamandrine Guard arriving. We mentioned briefly how important they could be for the House of Boar to win their own battle, but if they come over here and add a little bit of support, it could really pile the pressure on Nan Dungortheb as well. The Karangwi hunters are there to respond, though they'll find the Salamanders a tougher foe than the sentries of Galleon that they've already pushed to the edge of the map. And indeed the Salamandrine Guard not too concerned about simply charging into melee and going blow for blow with the spiders. You can see the very makeshift looking spears that the spider riders have, but I'm sure that the fangs of the giant arachnids themselves will also get involved here. Some of the Salamandrine Guard pushing well beyond and getting into the Duso Manuthan archers. But I think Nan Dungortheb will probably be the happier of the two. The Salamanders, however, pushing forward, and now perhaps seeing the way things are going, Panthan of Barsoom is going to be moving forward with his infantry, try and force the issue a little bit and show that elven finesse. Over here, meanwhile, fighting in the shadow of all of these ruins, and again, these units that are a little overextended, the Warband of Lothlin, the first units in, are the support units coming in here going to be enough to wither Nan Dungortheb sufficiently? Units in behind. Salamandrine Guard going to go in from the side over here. Oh, these Duso Manuthan Flesh Tearers will be struggling a little bit more, and you can see there the Amberona Honor Guard and Halberdiers moving in. I mean, these halberds on the front line are not really the sort of thing that Nan Dungortheb can force the issue against. Only really the very best of their spiders can do such, and that's by disrupting their formation more so than going blow for blow with them in melee. Elsewhere, we've got here, the Karangwi Broodmothers have been pretty hefty on the front line so far as well, with, they almost look like old school D&D trolls, don't they, the Devourers. The Devourers doing their job so far and staying alive in the face of any damage that the Warband can present them. Halberdiers, the first port of call for the Urish Abomination's bombardment. But I think it's going to be over here that's going to be a really interesting battle now. You can see Kinsmen of Denethor moving forward in the vanguard, and Nan Dungortheb in general are trying to move backwards, trying to set the engagement how they would like it. It's kind of a rarity, I think, that you would see Ossiriand be the ones to take the initiative. Kind of like how in the last battle, it's rare that you'll see Angband engage in such a defensive initial outlook, but the situation of the battles as we have seen them have led to both factions being taken out of their, not comfort zone necessarily, but normal modus operandi. And as this battle goes along, again, one of the intangibles is always seeing how effective archers can be over a longer period of time, and I think we're starting to see evidence of that in the Nan Dungortheb army here. Ossiriand, the damage they can do with their archers over a longer period of time is significant, and we're starting to see the Nan Dungortheb manpower get bled out at the wrists a little bit. Urish Abomination continues to do the same, however, but there's only one of him. Doing damage in that way is a slow burn, certainly. Kinsmen of Denethor are going to be a tough foe for much of the Nan Dungortheb infantry to try and crack through. Only really the strongest of their units will be capable of doing that. Outriders of Dwylwen also charging in here, getting a decent glancing charge off against the Flesh Tearers. Devourers coming in here as well. One thing they do have to be careful of still is the spiders, the hunting pack as well. War dogs, Mythen and Tolgalen still in reserve. So far, so good in this little attack. Over on this side of things, however, the Silver Wind throwing their javelins in. They certainly have an impressive name, and they're going to need to be impressive because on the other side of things, over here, well, the spiders are starting to shrivel a little bit, and actually it's looking more and more like the House of Boar's more rigid nature as the heaviest faction on the field is helping them somewhat, although the number of Duso-Manuthan units here are still a bit of a problem. The Gore Swarm in and amongst the Flesh Feasters as well. The toughest foe that they have as with regards to regular infantry, and the Warband of Lothlin will match up pretty poorly against them, although the Amberona Honour Guard are not too far away and they should have too much in the tank for these savages. The other Urish Abominations still trying to target the strong points of all of these halberdiers, which is definitely the right thing to do. It's the only way really they're going to be able to break through these front lines now. Oh, apologies, the Amberona Honour Guard were actually further north than I originally thought, but they are winning over here. And the problem with this is their best way for dealing with this sort of force, Nan Dungortheb, is to get in and around them, start charging in the rear. Positional victories, but they may not have the numbers to do that if they continue to take losses at this rate. Though, Hunting Pack and Flesh Feasters again isolated against the lower end of the Lothlin units. Not ideal for them. They do still have the opportunity. The Amberona, still 72 of them remaining, not a huge amount of losses taken. Obviously this is a shorter battle, so you don't expect units to capitulate so quickly, especially tankier bodyguard units like that, but Nan Dungortheb need to find some way of doing some damage to this eastern front line. You can see the challenge they're up against here. Their units are pretty light at this point. They need their monsters to be causing havoc in the backfield really in order for this to work. And you can see the far more organised nature of the House of Boar. Even their regular units, their entry-level spearmen, look pretty solid for their tier. Meanwhile, we got going on over here, Captain Gervais trying to chase the Silver Wind off, more out of necessity than anything else, I think, because those javelins were continuing to do a good amount of damage over on this side, and you can see the only thing that really remains on this flank now are the Karangwi Broodmothers, which are scary, certainly, but without any units to really follow through on the gains they make, you do wonder. Vanguard of Lothlin, swords in hand, ready to deal with the returning Devourers. Now let's see what's happening over here. Karangwi Bloodgorgers charging in. Things have developed pretty quickly over here, as perhaps you would expect. Mythern and Tol Galen and the Urfin End Tower now on the front lines also. The Devourers trying to do their thing, but the Elves do have the damage dealing capabilities to be a real problem there. As was thought, the Kinsmen of Denethor have remained rigid in the face of any damage really that could have been thrown at them. Further afield meanwhile, Urish Abomination, first time we've seen him in melee in this battle. Been a thorn in the side of the Elves thus far, but in melee, isolated as he is, damaging though he may be, I'm not sure he's going to the crazy death animation. It's been a while since we've seen that actually. Scouts of Gellion getting involved in melee. Once again, in melee they should have the beating of the Duso-Manuthan archers here. Still a lot of spiders here in the backfield, back from their escapades in the Hungering Maw. This is very similar actually. It's like a living artillery piece also, though its projectile is slightly different. I don't think we're going to see too much of it in this battle any longer, because this is the first we're seeing of them, and there we go. There she goes, I suppose. One of Ungoliant's spawn. Mythern and Tol Galen moving it again. This is the problem that you have if you really can't leverage your monsters as Nan Dungortheb. It is a problem for you, because when you see stuff like the Mythern, they may not be as defensively adept as the Amberona over on the other side, with the armour difference being fairly significant, but the Mythern still have far too much in the tank for much of the Duso-Manuthan infantry. All of it really, 1-to-1. Karangwi Hunters, and that is going to be that. Urush Abomination dies almost in complete conjunction with Nan Dungortheb's untimely demise. We'll see over here, Silver Wind just in time to see her charge into the Flesh Terrors. Perhaps that is a sign of how things are going. Amber and Honor Guard have taken a few more losses since last we saw them, but the Easterlings remaining resolute and steadfast. Elsewhere, the Silver Wind continue to tear through what remains. I think it's fairly clear we're going to be seeing a victory for the side of good today, in conjunction with what we witnessed last week between Feanor and Angband. Do so Manuthan Flesh Feast is still alive, so I mean they, with their adventure on the flank, did do their job. You kind of expect them to, though, against a singular unit of Spear Militia, a few skirmishers here and there, light skirmishers. It's exactly the sort of unit they should be strong against, but unfortunately in their victory they've turned around to realise pretty much the entirety of their army aside from them has been vanquished or stopped dead in its tracks. The Broodmother and the Hunting Pack notwithstanding, there's still some Predators over here as well. You can see all of the Karangwi Gore Swarm which die like by half burrowing themselves. Clan Guard of Lothlan trying to deal with the Predators. I mean, the Predators are a skirmishing unit first and foremost. Ossiriand may yet arrive to assist the House of Boar, which would be thematic, I suppose, given that the House of Boar's salamanders over on the other side. In the long run, you'd have to say that was a good move. They moved across and put extra pressure on Nan Dungortheb over there, and it was extra pressure they were not able to withstand. Still a few more Flesh Feasters over here as well, fighting alongside the Devourers. The Silver Wind, impressive looking unit. Are they going to go after the Spiders? Lances down. They are, and they are going to get a charge off as well, although I wonder how much of that the Hunting Pack actually absorbed for them. Damage being done. The Broodmother. I mean, to be fair, the Broodmother have proven themselves to be pretty damn resilient, because they've been involved pretty much since the word go in this fight over here between the Easterlings and Orcs, and they're still all standing, and they, at this point you would say they're probably going to be the last one standing for the red team as a whole. Indeed, Ossiriand do arrive, although I think it's only the Outriders of Dweilwyn that actually managed to further bloody their weapons as a result of heading over here. I think even without well, definitely without Ossiriand's help, the House of Boar still would have had enough to be victorious. I do like the visual design of the House of Boar. Yes, and it is. It's going to be the Karangwi Broodmothers who will be the last ones left. Lurching forward. I mean, Salamandrine Dragon Hunters, of course they do blend in a lot to the other Halberdiers, but we can assume that they did their job. They're still pretty healthy after all, and the front lines did not falter despite maybe some worry early on. Karangwi Broodmothers do run actually, so not the last ones left. Some Spider Riders getting hunted down by the joint cavalry force now. Anything else? Outriders of Dweilwyn still pestering the Spider as she tries to exit stage left. What's this? One Honor Guard. Hunting Pack that's routing. The Gore Swarm, which is the last ones left. The little insects scurrying around the outside of the field, trying to get a couple more kills off the charge, although Earthen Tower are not exactly the softest of targets now, are they? And that's going to be that. Or is it? Is there still something else? No. Okay. There you go. A good victory for the force of good this time. Like I said, in comparison to Evil's victory in our last Silmarillion replay, and Yeah, I think this one comes down less to any changes in mechanics and more just to the fact that when you've got a team game like this, sending over units to help your ally can often be very, very important, and we saw that today. Stewie's Salamandrine Guard moving over, and then Ossiriand. Once they got into melee, that was really the problem. Like, those Dusomanouthan units can actually do a decent amount of damage to lightly armoured forces like Ossiriand in response, but they themselves are not able to mitigate the damage in the way the elves are with their really high melee defense, and that was a big difference. That was a big point of difference. It's like I said, it was rare for Ossiriand to engage in that sort of target. It has been in the past, and it will continue to be so. They are, an archer-focused faction, lighter armor, that sort of thing. They're going to want to set engagements and be careful most of the time. But here, against this foe, considering the monsters, it was the right thing to do, and you saw that in the outcome, as it were. The House of Boar, it took them longer actually to chew their way through their opponents over on their side. They would have managed it with or without the victory on the other side. But that's to be expected because the House of Boar are a little bit more defensive in terms of their infantry. They're not going to deal damage as quickly, certainly not with their basic spears, but nor their line infantry. The halberdiers and some of the armour-piercing options that they have maybe a little bit more than Ossiriand, but that's not really that important against Nan Dungortheb, which is why you maybe didn't see the uptick in damage that you would against some others. As for Nan Dungortheb themselves, like I said, if you can't utilise their monsters effectively, then they will struggle. They don't have the heft on the front line to be able to bulldoze people. They don't have the finesse to be able to do damage quickly enough. They can be damaging on the front line. A lot of their units do have, considering their very low defense, their offense is actually okay for what they are, but it needs to be part of a combined effort with their monsters, with sort of other ranged supporting tools as well. And much like Ossiriand normally are, positioning is pretty key with them. It's not enough to simply advance forward and hope for the best like it is perhaps with, certainly Angband can still do that because of their rigidity, but also stuff like factions like Tolin Galhoth. They've got the ability, and they can also go into fast movers more traditionally with their wargs as well, whereas the spiders are smaller in number. They're very tough, and we did see examples of that today, but you do need to utilise them at just the right time because of their lower units. Kind of like trolls in that regard, but cavalry. Let's see what did the damage for Ossiriand at any rate. Spearmen of Rathloriel did well on the front line, the Earthen Tower, which got committed as well. Big damage from them, of course. Again, the armour piercing, not really the important thing, but the base damage, not bad. The Scouts of Gellion doing very nicely, the basic archers, kind of as you would expect actually because of the more limited defences that the Dusomanouthan have to work with. So at least 151 kills, the other one getting 324, which in a 2v2 pitch battle is very impressive. As for the heavy hitters, I mean, they only got involved a little bit later on. The Kinsmen of Denethor did a very good job on the front line just because of how resilient they are, but they also racked up a decent little kill count for themselves in for the deal as well. So yeah, obviously Panthan and Barsoom didn't actually send this one to me. This was one that I just harvested from the Silmarillion Discord, which is how things I think are going to be continuing to work moving forwards. But yes, we'll see what the next one brings, because like I said, I do intend for these to fill midweek slots between now and the end of the year, although one of those will very likely be the end of year channel update as well, but again, we'll see as we get closer to the time. But yeah, big thanks to all the players involved. I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.